Today on Calm Historian, we step into the Great Depression, a time when jobs vanished, banks collapsed, and ordinary families faced hunger and fear. It was worse than most imagine. Long bread lines, lost homes, and years of quiet despair that reshaped America. Before we begin, please comment your location and current local time. And if this journey helps you see the past more clearly, consider liking and subscribing. They called it the Great Depression, but that name never captured the shape of what people felt. It did not break a nation in a single morning. It was a long, cold unraveling. In late October of 1929, a Black Thursday, Black Monday, Black Tuesday, fortunes vanished in a few fevered hours and confidence turned brittle. That crash was only the first headline. What followed were months and years of painful contractions that folded prosperity into pinched faces and empty stomachs across the country. By the early 1930s, the machinery of American life had slowed to a shudder. Factories that had hummed in 1929 reduced shifts and then let long-standing men go. Industrial output plunged, wages fell, small businesses closed their doors. Unemployment climbed to levels most had not imagined. By 1933, roughly 1 in 4 workers had no job. Families who had once signed mortgages and paid for college found themselves standing in line under skeletal signage, clutching ration tickets handed out by churches and charitable kitchens. Peacetime cities, once noisy with commerce, began to look like the pictures we now associate with the era. Men in threadbare suits sitting on curbs, mothers holding children while the line moved forward for a bowl of soup. Banks, once seen as pillars of trust, proved fragile, and then fragile no longer. Between 1930 and 1933, roughly 9,000 banks failed, their shutters slamming on depositors' hopes and savings. A rumor of closure could empty a branch in an hour. The loss of trust turned paperwork into peril. The federal government moved haltingly at first, and then with the force of a leader determined to restore order. Franklin D. Roosevelt took office in March 1933 and began within days and weeks to remake how Americans thought about risk, assistance, and the role of the state. His fireside chats, calm, conversational radio broadcasts, crossed living room air and steadied the private fears of families gathered by a single lamp. One of his first acts was to call a bank holiday in March 1933, closing banks while the government examined them, rebuilt public confidence, and rewired the rules of finance. Laws separated the dangerous gambling of investment banking from the everyday business of holding deposits, and the federal government began insuring bank accounts so people would not lose everything if a local institution failed. Roosevelt also reached into the nation's laboring fields and forests to create work, paying men to plant trees, build parks, pave roads, and raise public buildings. The alphabet soup of agencies, the CEC, the TVA, the WPA, became lifelines, sending men into forests and fields to fight erosion, lighting rural valleys with electricity, and reviving towns with public works. The Social Security Act of 1935 sketched a new bargain between citizens and the state, a safety net for the elderly, the unemployed, and those who could not work. Relief was real, but it was never enough to erase daily hunger and humiliation. On the plains, the Depression dovetailed with a brutal drought and years of poor farming practices, turning topsoil into dust. The Dust Bowl rolled across the southern Great Plains in the mid-1930s. Storms lifted the earth and turned afternoons into darkness. Crops failed, livestock wasted, and whole families, their homes caked with grit, their barns empty, hooked wagons and trucks toward California and the promise of harvests. Newspapers clipped their identity into a single word: Okies. Thousands of migrants arrived at the West Coast's edge and were often met with suspicion, crowded into shacks and makeshift camps where pay was low and security nearly non-existent. The decade was also one of political and cultural upheaval. In 1932, veterans of the First World War, the Bonus Army, marched on Washington to demand compensation they had been promised. Their encampments were cleared in a scene that erupted into violence and left a scar on public memory. Internationally, trade that once moved freely across oceans slowed as nations retreated behind tariffs and protectionism, making recovery slower and replacing cooperation with suspicion. Banks and governments buckled under strains that crossed borders, and the world felt suddenly smaller and meaner. Yet even in the worst years, there were small resistances to despair. Neighbors pooled resources, shared rooms, and opened kitchens. Churches and local charities pushed out food and hope in whatever measure they could. Artists, writers, and photographers moved through these years with cameras and pens, capturing faces that statistics could not. Songs rose from labor camps. Novels traced the miles of migration. Photographs fixed breadlines and dust-choked prairies in a way that named both shame and courage. Those images and voices kept alive the quiet dignity of people refusing to vanish. The New Deal did not cure everything at once. Courts reversed or narrowed some measures. Others were reshaped as politics and pressure moved. By the late 1930s, the economy still had not returned to the heady levels of the 1920s, and many families lived with lingering uncertainty. It would take the mobilization of a later decade to push the nation into full employment. Still, the reforms of the 1930s, a new federal regulatory architecture, commitments to social insurance and investments in infrastructure, changed the relationship between citizens and their government in ways that lasted long after the immediate emergency. To walk through a town of the 1930s was to see the Depression's many faces. A factory gate with a few men standing like statues, a farm porch with peeling paint, and a father staring at a sky where a storm was gathering. A makeshift shanty labeled Hooverville, a name that mixed accusation and lament. A child with stockings full of holes running past a storefront that bears a "Help Wanted" sign, and no one stepping forward. The story of those years is as much the hush inside a household where the bread is gone as it is the headlines and laws. So when you hear the Great Depression, imagine more than a chapter heading in an economic textbook. Imagine faces lit by kerosene lamps in rented rooms, imaginations working overtime to keep hunger at bay, and millions of small decisions made under pressure: to leave home, to send children to relatives, to swallow pride for a bowl of soup. The dates and statistics, the crash of October 1929, the climb to nearly a quarter of the workforce unemployed by 1933, the flood of bank failures, and the programs born in 1933 and the years that followed, are anchors. The fuller measure is how a people bent under strain and then, slowly and imperfectly, rebuilt a sense of security and mutual obligation that helped shape the century to come. The Great Depression was among the worst horrors in American history, and most people today do not know the full extent of the catastrophe or the daily suffering it caused. It was horrific, not because one part of life faltered for a while, but because the ground gave way beneath everything people had built. Factories that had hummed, shop windows that had glowed with carefully arranged displays, and farms that fed whole towns. Each slowed, stuttered, and then stopped. Money, the simple thing people needed to buy bread, pay rent, and keep the lights on, seemed to leak out of the world. It did not just fall in value. It vanished from households like a tide, pulling out to sea, leaving bare shelves and quiet rooms. Families woke to a new arithmetic. Wages that once arrived like clockwork no longer came. Envelopes that used to contain pay were folded and empty. Mothers opened cupboards and found fewer cans. Fathers cradled pay stubs that read zero. And children learned quickly how hunger felt and how to weigh the last crust of bread. Conversations around kitchen tables tightened into careful lists of essentials, a map of what could be given up and what could not. Pride and anxiety braided together as men and women who had always provided negotiated humiliations, scraped for credit at the grocer's, or kept a silence when the landlord knocked at the door. Employers watched their ledgers and felt the same slow slide toward nothing. Orders dried up, customers stopped coming, and owners cut hours, then jobs, then closed doors. Payrolls became impossible to meet because the very flow of demand, people buying goods and services, had stopped. When workers were not paid, they could not meet their own obligations. When those workers could not spend, the next business lost a sale, and the chain pulled another link free. You could see the consequences in empty storefronts, the dimming of neon signs, and the hush of factories at noon. You could see it in lines of people standing with hopeful, patient faces where once there had been bustling trade. The economy did not merely falter in one neighborhood or one industry. It contracted in every direction until ordinary life itself felt precarious. In that wide space of vanishing money and shrinking opportunity, survival became the day's hard work. Old routines were thrown aside and new ones invented around how little remained, sharing meals, trading favors, and stretching every resource. The scenes of those years, the quiet streets, the hollowed-out shops, the kitchen table reckonings, tell how deeply the country was shaken and how people learned to carry on when almost everything they had relied on had disappeared. Consequently, stores shuttered, factories went dark, and governments at every level began to crumble because nobody was paying taxes. In many regions, the only institution left trying to function was the federal government. And even then it was often reduced to the desperate business of simply paying wages and keeping the lights on. To see how vast the Great Depression was, you can follow the sorrow it left behind, on the streets, on the farms, and in the rooms where families once ate together. It began as numbers on a ledger, a frantic fall on the stock exchange in October 1929. But those numbers did not stay in a ticker. They swelled into lines of depositors outside neighborhood banks, into the shuttered windows of Main Street storefronts, into the rusted gates of farms where fences sagged and silos stood empty. When banks failed and credit froze, people who had paid their bills faithfully found their savings gone overnight. Men and women who had planned for retirement or a child's education discovered there would be no safety net. In March 1933, the new president ordered a brief closing of the nation's banks and spoke to the country by radio, trying to still the panic. so people would not lose what little they had left. Out in the fields, the collapse of agricultural prices hammered families in another way. Wheat and cotton sold for pennies compared with the boom years. Mortgage payments could not be met, and the courts signed papers that took land away from the people who had worked it for generations. Where drought and dust joined the economic blows across the Great Plains, whole communities watched topsoil lift off the ground and swallow fences and barns in choking storms. Families packed what they could into the backs of jalopies and headed west along Route 66, carrying a few trunks, a stove, and the fragile hope of work on the other side of the horizon. Cities offered no easy refuge. Houses were lost to foreclosure. Rents went unpaid. Doors were nailed shut. People set up makeshift camps of tar paper and scrap lumber in parks and on vacant lots, bitterly naming them Hoovervilles after the president they felt had failed them. Downtown squares became places of quiet shame, where the hungry lined up for a bowl of stew and a crust of bread, faces hollowed by fatigue and pride. Fathers rode the rails in search of seasonal work and came back with stories of jobless towns everywhere. Mothers learned to stretch a meager pot of soup, to sew and mend and barter, while children learned too young the sharp taste of scarcity. Relief came slowly and imperfectly. Public works crews built roads and parks. Programs put young men to work, planting trees and carving trails, and for the first time a federal safety net began to be woven into law. But for millions, these measures arrived after long months of fear and hunger. The Great Depression was not a single headline or a day on a market ticker. It was the steady sinking of ordinary life, the loss of a bank book, the silence of a barn, an eviction notice tucked under a door, and the daily gritty invention of ways to survive. Seen this way, its scale becomes simple and terrible to imagine. It reached into the bones of the nation and altered how Americans lived, worked, and trusted the world around them, leaving scars and stories that would be passed down for generations. I'm ready to do this, but I don't see the historical fragment to expand. Please paste the text you wanted. Transformed. A few quick questions, so I get it exactly how you want it. Answer any or all. Do you want a target length? Words or minutes of audio? You said about the same length. Is that fine? Or do you want longer or shorter? Preferred voice, talk tone, calm, dramatic, intimate, documentary, or something else? Any narrator, persona, or gender you prefer, neutral, warm male, warm female, authoritative, etc. Any specific phrases, dates, or names that must be preserved exactly as written. Any other constraints, e.g., avoid certain words, include sound cues, or reading speed. If you'd like me to proceed without extra input, I can expand the text you paste into a polished, immersive voiceover in a documentary tone and keep all facts and details. Paste the fragment, and I'll get started. Over 1/3 of the nation's banks died. Say it slowly, and listen to the sentence settle like a winter dusk over town squares and city blocks. In rooms where ledgers used to be opened with a kind of quiet ceremony, and in kitchens where a morning coffee once warmed the hand that balanced the family checkbook. The image is blunt and intimate. Doors that used to open to the clink of coin and the soft voice of a teller now hang silent. Windows that once caught the light of commerce stare out like the eyes of shuttered houses. Where there had been a steady rhythm of deposits and withdrawals, contracts signed and promises kept. There is instead a hollow beat, a space hammered into the daily life of a nation. Picture the small bank on the corner of Main Street, a brick building with tired brass letters above the door, the town's anchor for generations. Farmers cashed checks there after market. Newlyweds came to open joint accounts. The retired seamstress collected her modest pension. Now a simple paper notice, polite and final, announces the closure in a typeface, as unemotional as a courthouse docket. People gather at the curb, craning to read words that rearrange futures. Conversations in the barber shop stutter. The shopkeeper across the street counts, change more carefully than he ever had. In the big cities, long corridors where bankers once paced with the assured gait of those who knew the pulse of their institution, fall into a strained hush. Clerks who could name the exact place of every stamped ledger stand staring at vault doors that refuse to open to their touch. The loss is both material and moral. For many, money is more than figures on a page. It's food, rent, gas for the tractor, tuition for a child. The dead banks leave behind not just unpaid loans and balancing errors, but long chains of interrupted lives. A mill owner who depended on a line of credit hears the plant grow suddenly louder. Machines idle, workers linger at doorways, wages are delayed. A widow who tucked away pennies for a quiet future watches that private safety evaporate into bureaucratic limbo. Trust, once a kind of public currency, is diminished. People learn to measure the solidity of an institution not by its facade, but by the trembling confidence of its customers. There is a funeral quality to the way entire neighborhoods adjust. Chairs that had been set at kitchen tables for conversations about savings are moved aside. Meetings that once convened beneath the bank's awning are held in cramped living rooms where neighbors compare notes and swallow hard. The shuttered bank buildings take on a monument-like air. Heavy doors barred against the possibility of reopening, locks no longer needing to be wound, vaults that keep their silence like sealed tombs, daily rituals. The morning deposit, the midday transfer, the quarter-hour exchange with a trusted teller are gone, and with them a scaffolding of certainty people had relied on without thinking to name it. The consequences ripple outward. Shops tighten their belts. Hiring freezes settle in. Plans for expansion are folded away like a coat. Young people who once hoped to launch businesses put their dreams on hold. Farmers who planned a new season's seed pay bills with one eye on the closed bank's notice. Even the language of civic life shifts. Phrases like "my bank" and "the bank" lose the reassurance they once carried. Where commerce had been a steady current, it becomes a lenticular stream, broken by unseen rocks and moving in fits and starts. Yet beneath this surface of loss, quieter human stories begin to emerge. Neighbors help neighbors. Hands pass envelopes at kitchen tables, and small, unrecorded acts of solidarity stitch communities back together. People gather not just to vent anger and fear, but with a hard-edged resolve to understand how so many pillars crumbled at once. They learn to count on one another in ways their ledgers never recorded, inventing a kind of mutual ledger made of favors, shared food, and late-night phone calls. Over 1/3 of the nation's banks died, and the country feels that loss in every town and city. In the hush of closed doors, the folded notices pinned in windows, and the rearranged schedules of ordinary life. It is a kind of national mourning, not for people, but for a set of predictable collaborations that had quietly sustained daily life. Those empty buildings, those tightened purses, remain stark evidence of a sudden fracture in the economic landscape. As people move forward, the memory of that quiet devastation lingers, teaching in its own somber way about fragility, about trust, and about the small human systems that bind a nation together. Economic historians estimate that between 9,000 and 11,000 of the nation's banks collapsed during the Depression. America had around 25,000 banks in 1929. By 1933, nearly half of them had vanished. Those numbers sound abstract until you picture what happened on an ordinary morning, when a rumor could change everything. Word would slip from mouth to ear. A whisper at the grocer's, a worried comment on a streetcar, and by mid-morning the sidewalks in front of neighborhood banks were clogged. Men in work-stained coats and women holding small children queued beneath the stoop, clutching passbooks and folded bills as if they were talismans. Faces reflected disbelief and urgency. Neighbors who had always trusted the polite clerk behind the counter now elbowing forward, voices high and raw, demanding the one thing they believed would keep them afloat: cash. Inside, clerks moved with the mechanical politeness of people trained to reassure, counting out coins and folding notes, but their hands shook. The tills that had been filled in better seasons felt shockingly light. The banks did not have the reserves to meet the flood of demands, and there was no federal safety net to promise the frightened crowd that their money would be safe if they waited. As more people withdrew, some left empty-handed, and a sense of inevitability hardened like frost on a pane. Late in the day, a small, official-looking notice might appear on a glass door. A key would turn, a handle would be lifted. No one answered. In a single, heartbreaking gesture, some institutions locked their doors forever. Counters cooled, chairs were tucked back, and the echo of footsteps carried through spaces that a week before had hummed with routine trust. The shock went beyond ledgers and vaults. It lived in quiet kitchens where bills could not be paid, in the hollow eyes of men and women who had believed stability was a given. Trust, once the invisible currency of community life, had been deeply shaken. The empty bank rooms stood as a mute testament to how quickly calm could fracture into panic when people feared the worst, and there was nothing left to hold them back. Only about 8,000 banks belonged to the Federal Reserve System, leaving most banks outside any real government oversight. There was no deposit insurance either, so when a bank failed, a person's life savings could vanish in an instant. That lack of protection didn't explode into a single dramatic headline. Instead, the unraveling happened in 1,000 small, urgent gestures. People who had once trusted pay envelopes and ledgers with their deepest security began to wake at night, seized by a private panic. They hauled trunks from attics, checked the seams of sofas, and shoved hands into the hollows beneath floorboards. By lamplight, they counted bills until their fingers cramped, the paper whispering like dry leaves. Quiet rituals took hold in kitchens and bedrooms. A folded stack slid beneath a mattress, coins wrapped in scraps and tucked into a pillow, paper money secreted into the hem of a quilt. The work felt foolish and ridiculous and yet impossibly necessary. The last tangible control, when the institutions that had promised safety no longer inspired trust, As currency accumulated under cushions and in closets, the damage spread beyond private rooms. Credit stuttered and then stopped. Suppliers who once accepted a signature or a promise refused to send more goods. Local shopkeepers found purchases on account impossible. The easy, friendly arrangements that greased daily life dissolved as lenders tightened their hands. Loans families and small businesses had counted on to bridge a bare month, or to modernize a machine simply vanished into an anxious silence. Offers of future payment were met with polite declines or blank stares. The city responded not with chaos, but with a strange, resigned stillness. Streets that had hummed with trade fell quiet. Factories and workshops slow to a hesitant crawl as unpaid bills piled up and orders were deferred. Delivery wagons stood idle like exhausted beasts. Storefronts that once threw open their doors drew down their shades. Inside homes, the hoarded cash became a bitter comfort, an emergency supply that could not be spent if there was nowhere willing to extend credit, and a constant, heavy reminder of how fragile the old certainties had been. There was no public spectacle, only a weary private endurance, neighbors guarding what they could, merchants shrinking their ledgers, communities learning to live with less. In the lamplight, with folded bills tucked under mattresses and quiet streets outside, the ordinary machinery of business and trust ground toward a halt, and people did what they could to keep going. I'm ready to turn Section 3 into a vivid audiobook-ready passage about mass unemployment and the loss of work. But I don't actually have the fragment you want me to expand. The prompt I received only shows the heading 2. Unemployment hit unimaginable levels. To preserve the facts, dates, and events, exactly as in your original text, I need that original fragment pasted here so I can enrich the language without changing the content. If you don't have the fragment handy, tell me which historical moment you mean. Do you mean the U.S. Great Depression around 1929-1933, the global 2008-2009 financial crash, unemployment after the COVID-19 lockdowns in 2020, or another country and time? Choose one of those or name a different moment, and I'll expand it faithfully. I won't proceed with a specific narrative until you confirm which event you want, so I don't introduce or alter facts you care about. Also, let me know any concrete details that must remain exactly as in the original. Specific dates, names, figures, or phrases that I should not change. Tell me your desired final length or spoken time, for example, about 2 minutes or about 5 minutes, and the tone you want: somber, urgent, reflective, neutral, so the voice matches the subject. Once you paste the fragment or confirm the event and constraints, I'll produce a coherent, fluid, and engaging voice-over-ready narration that removes repetitions, smooths transitions, and adds tasteful atmospheric detail while keeping every fact and date intact. By 1933, unemployment had ripped through communities so widely that roughly 25% of the workforce was without work. In some great industrial cities, it was even worse. Cleveland, Chicago, and Detroit saw jobless rates climb to nearly half of the population that once built and ran the country's engines. The great buildings that had once hummed with purpose now stood like hulking monuments to a sudden, unthinkable quiet. Conveyors that had roared and stamping presses that had hammered out parts by the thousand were silent, answered only by the hiss of wind through broken panes. Thick columns of brick and steel rose from yards littered with oil-dark puddles and bent rebar, their gates chained and their nameplates tarnished. In the long empty bays, the machines lay cold and still. Belts sagged, tools gathered dust, and the faint ghost of hot metal and machine grease lingered in the air, as if time itself could not quite let go of what had been. Pallets and crates, once bristling with product and purpose, waited in the shadow of loading docks that no longer saw a single truck. The men and women who had kept those places alive found their daily rhythms broken. Carpenters with knuckles stained by varnish, machinists who could coax 1/1000th of an inch from stubborn steel, engineers whose calculations had once guaranteed everything fit together. These steady hands folded over cupped palms, work boots that had climbed scaffolds and factory stairs shuffled on sidewalks between recruitment posters and closed doors. At the break of day, small, uncertain clusters gathered to watch temp agencies write names on lists, hoping a few days' wages might buy a week's groceries. Some hung their sharpened chisels, calibrated gauges, and leather aprons on hooks, because no one offered the work that made those tools necessary. Others, hat in hand, moved from street corner to street corner, asking for day labor, their voices low and their pride buried beneath the need to feed a family. And everywhere, private worlds felt the same ruthless contraction. Families who had once called themselves comfortable, breadwinner steady, parlor kept, children in clean uniforms, found their cupboards sighing empty. Lampshades that had once softened evening conversations now seemed to highlight the thinness of supper. Mothers and fathers counted coins at kitchen tables that had known better meals. Silence grew heavy where laughter had lived. Lines formed outside mission halls and church doors, a steady procession of stooped shoulders and blank eyes, of small, hopeful hands reaching for bowls of soup, passed by volunteers who moved with the practiced sympathy of people who had done this too long. In homes and on sidewalks, worry-furrowed brows and knotted hands. The daily negotiations of hunger and hope replaced plans for the future. The city's familiar cadence, torches of light, clanging rails, confident footfalls, had been dulled into a slow, hard breathing of a place, waiting to be rebuilt. While those who had kept it running learned in the most painful way that skill and steadiness do not always shield a life from want. When the work vanished, whole households shifted like sand. Men who had once provided for their families found themselves with no jobs and nowhere to turn. Some left in silence, doors closing behind them with the weight of shame and desperation, and took to the railroads. They rode the boxcars as hobos, a rough fraternity of people searching for odd jobs and a chance to eat, work that too often simply didn't exist. Those left at home learned a new economy of survival. Women counted coins under lamplight and stretched food until it was almost invisible, turning plain staples into meals that could feed more mouths for one more day. They mended clothing until fabric thinned to threads, bartered what little they could, and kept accounts in their heads to make sure nothing was wasted. Pride was folded into every careful decision. Children felt the changes first and felt them most keenly. Where there had been regular meals and worn shoes mended in time, there were now empty plates and quiet stomachs. Play retreated from parks and backyards into smaller, quieter corners of the house, because hunger dulls even the loudest laughter. illness and fatigue followed, and the small bodies of children bore the slow cost of scarcity. Communities changed as well. Neighbors who once relied on steady paychecks found themselves leaning on one another for small kindnesses. A loaf shared, a night's watch over a child, a handful of vegetables from a backyard. But goodwill could not always fill bellies, and the lines at soup kitchens and relief stations grew longer, voices softer with worry. This was a time when ordinary routines frayed, and people learned new, hard lessons about endurance. Some left to chase work on the rails, others stayed to hold the household together. All of them carried the quiet weight of that era, the shame, the resourcefulness, and the heartbreak of children who often went hungry. The sight was a bitter, unanswerable paradox, a nation of wide fields and laden orchards that by every right of soil and season could have fed itself many times over. Yet millions of its people went hungry. Acres rolled away under a sun that bleached the hedgerows and pushed the wind across heavy stalks and pods. Wheat and corn and beets waited in the furrows, like a promise turned to mockery. Apples yellowed on their trees, vegetables curled and softened under the hot sky. The simple expense of hauling that harvest home was more than many farmers could bear, and so the yield stood and spoiled where it grew. Men and women who had worked those fields all their lives, hands rough, faces lined, watched the crop blacken at the edges and insects move in, powerless, or too proud to sweep it up for nothing. Tractors sat idle, and wagons lay unused, the tools of summer care left to rust beside fence posts. Fields that ought to have been turned into winter stores were given back to the weather, and the air took on the heavy sweetness of rot. A low, constant hum of flies turned abundance into something obscene. Milk, that simple daily comfort, ran in white ribbons into roadside ditches. Whole cans poured out where there was no market or no buyer, the milk cooling and souring in the sun like a grief made visible. Those pale streams crept between fence posts and through long grass, a bright, shameful answer to the sound of empty bowls in distant rooms. In the cities, the contrast was a private cruelty. Children grew thin in the shadow of that same plenty, their small bodies hollowed by missed meals. Nights were filled with the small, sharp noises of hunger, the folding of blankets, the soft whimpering, the practiced stillness of little ones who taught themselves to make less sound so the world would not notice. Parents cupped their hands over empty pantries and stared, thinking of acres left unharvested and milk poured out on the roadsides, feeling the bitter unfairness of a system where abundance and want could sit cheek by cheek. The country's richness only made the suffering sharper. There was no shortage of food, only a shortage of the means to move it from field to table, denied by hard arithmetic and circumstance. It is a picture that lodges in the throat. Hungry children in gray city evenings, and at the very same moment, fruit falling and rotting on the ground, milk running off into gullies. The contrast was not merely economic, but moral, a scene that smelled of sour milk and fresh earth, and sounded with the quiet despair of people who had worked a lifetime only to watch plenty slip through their fingers. Soup kitchens and bread lines became the face of the time. Photographs show endless rows of men in tattered coats, shoulders hunched against the cold, waiting for a bowl of thin stew while steam rose like ghosts from big iron kettles. For many families, charity was the only thing standing between survival and death. A last, fragile lifeline that arrived in the shape of a warm spoon and a paper cup. Malnutrition carved itself quietly at first, and then in ways you could not ignore. Tiny bodies that should have been growing taller and stronger stayed small. Knees that never quite straightened, shirts that hung loose on narrowing shoulders, faces that kept a soft roundness even as limbs thinned. Hair lost its sheen. The bright alertness that belongs to childhood dulled into an almost constant listlessness. Inside those shrinking bodies, the defenses meant to fend off everyday illnesses, the coughs, the scrapes, the seasonal fevers, were weakened. Children became vulnerable in a way numbers on a page can't fully convey. What followed was a steady, heartbreaking rise in preventable illness. Infections took deeper hold, recovery stretched longer, and small ailments that might once have been shrugged off sometimes turned dangerous. Parents lived with a constant low-level terror, a fever that would not break, a cough that would not go away, a child who could not seem to rally. Hospitals and clinics filled with the same weary faces, eyes heavy with exhaustion, hands that had done the work of keeping a household afloat, now trembling with worry. Medicines and meals, when they could be found, were rationed between siblings and across generations, each split a fresh grief. All the while, a stubborn myth about hunger began to crumble. The comforting illusion that starvation belonged only to the very poorest, that it was someone else's problem on someone else's street, was swept away by a harsher reality. Hunger proved blind to neat categories. It crept into row houses and apartment buildings, into modest homes of people who had once been secure, and into the farmhouses of those who had always worked the land. It touched families who had thought themselves safe, seeping into the ordinary routines of life until it became impossible to ignore at mealtime, at school, at bedtime. What emerged was a strange, painful leveling. The same hollow eyes, the same slow growth, the same quiet dread appeared everywhere, no matter what a family's past had promised. Neighbors who once traded recipes now compared ways to stretch a single pot of soup. Fathers who had measured success in paychecks and promotions found themselves measuring the last of the flour. Mothers who had believed scarcity happened elsewhere learned to count spoonfuls and to hand out slices of bread like precious currency. The ordinary sounds of daily life, the clatter of pots, a child's laugh, were underscored by a new, pervasive hush of uncertainty. This was not the distant tragedy of abstract statistics. It was the intimate, relentless erosion of childhood and health. You could see it in the way a child reached for a toy and came up short, or in the small, tired failure to climb to the top of the jungle gym. Lives and futures were reshaped. Communities changed. The old stories that separated us from them fell away, leaving a clearer, harder truth. Hunger was not confined to a single corner of society. What remained was urgent and simple: to feed the children, to protect fragile bodies, to restore the promise that growing up should mean gaining strength and the chance to be well. The 1930s on the Great Plains felt like a slow, quiet siege. Farmers who had once taken pride in tilled fields and steady seasons found themselves cornered by two relentless forces: an economy stacked against them and a land that suddenly turned against its caretakers. Prices for wheat and cotton had collapsed. Loans came due. and small mortgages became chains. Bank notices arrived like winter, unavoidable and cold, reminding families that a single bad year could cost them the home their grandparents had built. Men sorted ledgers in kitchen light, counting out pennies while trying to protect the last seeds, the last parcels of earth that still meant something in a world that now measured value in dollars. Then the wind came. The Dust Bowl wasn't a single storm, but a series of black blizzards that stripped the prairie of topsoil and smothered crops before they could grow. Dust crept under doors, filled children's mouths and lungs, and turned day into dusk. Horses and cows weakened, wells choked with silt. Families swept dust from furniture only to watch it settle again. Where debt had slowly tightened the noose, the dust tightened it faster. Fields that might have bought another season were suddenly worthless, and the math that once balanced books now said exile. The result was migration, heartbreak, and hard choices. Whole communities packed what they could and joined long lines of cars and wagons heading west, hoping California or a new job might offer a fresh start. Others held on, leaning on neighbors, trading labor for food, or accepting work on government programs that would later try to heal the soil. Looking back at the era as a lesson in how human systems and the forces of nature can combine to undo lives. When markets fail and the land fails with them, ordinary people are left to pay the price. The Depression hit rural America with brutal force. Falling crop prices meant farmers couldn't pay their loans, and foreclosures swept across the Midwest, forcing families off the land they had cultivated for generations. Whole communities that once measured time by planting and harvest found their calendars emptied and their savings gone, leaving doors to farmhouses open to the wind and banners of "for sale" on silent porches. The years around the early 1930s took on a color no painter would choose. A flat, exhausted brown that swallowed the horizon and left the world stripped of softness. Rolling fields of wheat and corn, once green and full, turned season by season into a parched, broken skin. Rain that had come for generations grew scarce, and where crops had been coaxed by sun and sweat, there was now only a hard crust that cracked underfoot. The land itself seemed to give up. Stalks withered at their roots, fences sagged under the weight of dust, and the small, steady sounds of a working farm, the rustle of grain, the call of birds, the clank of tools, fell away into a silence that felt more like a warning. That silence had a cause people had not fully understood when the boom years blinded them. Reckless farming practices, meant to squeeze out ever greater yields, had stripped the prairie of its native grasses and loosened the soil with deep plowing. When drought came, there was nothing left to hold the earth in place. Winds rose like thieves and took the topsoil with them, whipping it into storm after storm. Day would turn to gloom as curtains of dust swept across fields and towns, the sun dimming to a bruised coin in a sky full of grit. Porches, doorsteps, and fences disappeared beneath new, merciless drifts of earth, and whole neighborhoods found themselves buried under a landscape they no longer owned. For thousands of families, the farm was no longer livelihood, but ruin. Men and women who had sown and reaped packed what little they could carry. A few clothes, cherished kitchen things, the photographs that kept faces alive, onto battered trucks and the few vehicles they could afford. Children sat on bundles, their faces streaked with dust, listening to parents whose low, steady voices tried to hide both fear and a fierce determination. The road they followed led westward, toward California, toward a hope the map could not guarantee, but the heart could not resist. The promise of greener fields met a hard, unwelcoming reality. Many who arrived found doors closed and work scarce. Neighbors who had their own fears often saw newcomers as a problem rather than as fellow people in need. Tents and shanties sprang up on the edges of towns, and the work that was available was grueling. Endless stooping under a merciless sun, bending over rows that seemed to run forever. Wages were humiliatingly small, pennies for an hour's back-breaking labor, money that barely bought a meal. Still, families held on, driven by the same stubborn hope that had pushed them into the dust. They endured long days and insults, kept faith with one another, and clung to the belief that somewhere beyond the next ridge, the earth would be kinder. They kept telling themselves that the dawn after a night of storms would bring a softer light, and that a place where the land answered to care was waiting beyond the horizon. I don't see the historical fragment you want me to turn into a voiceover. The placeholder expanded is empty. Please paste the exact text, or a clear, detailed summary of its facts, dates, their people, and key events, so I can expand it and rewrite it into a coherent, fluid, voiceover-ready narrative. A few quick questions, so I get the tone and length right. Do you want a particular narrative voice or mood? Somber, urgent, reflective, plain-spoken? How long should the final piece be? Approximate word count or audio duration? Should I preserve any specific phrases or terminology exactly as written? Do you want me to expand it fivefold as in your earlier note, or to keep roughly the same length? If you don't have the fragment handy, I can proceed from a clear summary. Country, time period, key events, and dates. Just confirm that and give the details. Once you send the text or answers, I'll produce the full voiceover script with natural transitions and tasteful, immersive detail. As people lost jobs and farms, they also lost their homes. Families who could no longer pay their mortgages moved into shacks, cardboard shelters, or makeshift camps that sprang up on the outskirts of the city. These sprawling communities of the dispossessed were called Hoovervilles, named after President Herbert Hoover, who many blamed for failing to stop the crisis. The margins of urban life had become a new, rough landscape. Parks that once held picnics now sheltered ragged clusters of lean-tos. Little rooms of necessity built from whatever could be pried loose or salvaged. Thin planks and warped boards leaned against one another. Corrugated tin was hammered flat and nailed into place. Torn tarps were stretched into roofs, and folding doors were turned on their sides to form walls. Along riverbanks and under freeway ramps, people pressed themselves into any stretch of flat ground they could find, arranging their few possessions around a sputtering pot or a small, guarded fire. Empty lots, with weeds knee-high and chain-link fences sagging, were dotted with these fragile villages, tin glinting in the sun by day and laking in the rain at night. Inside those huts, the ordinary rhythms of life went on in small, improvisational ways. A parent coaxed a child to sleep on a pallet of old blankets, while a kettle warmed slowly over coals. Voices stayed low. Worry threaded through them, but so was a small, steady tenderness. Someone might be mending a shirt by lamplight, another sweeping a patch of dirt like it could hold back the cold. The smell of smoke and damp wood hung in the air, mixed with the iron tang of nearby railroad tracks and the city's ever-present grit. Nights were especially hard. Whole families huddled beneath bridges, where the stone arches muffled the roar of traffic above and offered a thin shield from wind and rain. Others made beds on the rusted floors of abandoned railroad cars, curling up amid the echoes of a world that still moved for many, but had left them behind. In those narrow, borrowed shelters, the boundary between public and private blurred. A borrowed blanket could be privacy, a shared fire could be warmth, and yet life continued. Children found games in scraps and turned broken toys into treasures. Neighbors shared bread and traded small favors, as if the act of helping could stitch their lives back together. People kept hold of dignity in the patchwork of their shelters, shaping a fragile community out of whatever they could salvage, determined to endure another day. Section 7. Psychological and social consequences. I don't have the historical fragment you want expanded. Please paste the original text. The 6. The psychological toll was devastating. Fragment, so I can transform it into a vivid audiobook-ready narrative that is 5 times longer while keeping all facts, dates, and key events unchanged. A few quick clarifying questions will help me match your expectations. Do you want me to keep the original narrator perspective, if any? Or may I shift voice to third-person omniscient or another style? Any preference for tone? Solemn, intimate, urgent, reflective, or something else? Do you need a target word count or spoken duration for the final piece? Are there any words or phrases from the original you absolutely want preserved verbatim? Paste the fragment and answer any of the above if you have a preference, and I'll produce the expanded, polished narration. Beyond the empty cupboards and worn shoes, the depression did something harsher. It broke spirits. Proud men who had once supported their families found themselves reduced to beggars. Suicide rates climbed sharply, especially among businessmen and farmers who had lost everything and saw no way back. The collapse was not just economic. It was a slow unmaking of dignity. They were children of an era that taught its lessons with sharp edges. In the gray light of the 1930s, homes felt smaller and quieter than they had a decade before. Cupboards were half empty, an extra coat lay on every chair, and the word economy was spoken in low, careful tones at kitchen tables. Mothers who had once thrown away bruised fruit learned to boil peels into broth and save crusts to feed tomorrow's porridge. Fathers came home from lines at the relief station with faces that had learned the shape of disappointment. Children watched and learned with the patient, imitative cruelty of kids who must survive. How to iron a shirt until it looked new, how to mend a sole so it would not split the next winter, and above all, how not to waste a scrap of bread. Banks that had once been pillars of the town became places of risk in those young eyes. Shuttered windows, notices of failed institutions nailed to doors, neighbors whispering about lost savings. Where people had once trusted a ledger, money felt safer under a floorboard, in a jar on the pantry shelf, or in the dark pocket of a coat. Fear settled into habit, little acts, refusing a slice of cake because it felt extravagant, counting pennies twice before buying shoes, clutching a small savings envelope like a talisman, were not mere thriftiness, but the living memory of having had nothing. Those lessons stuck. Even when paychecks grew fuller and towns began to hum with business again, the memory of hunger and sudden loss lived on in the hands and voices of that generation. They taught their children to be careful, to plan, to distrust promises that sounded too good, and to measure generosity against the caution carved into them by those hard years. Habits learned at kitchen tables and in bread lines became family habits. The economic crisis of the 1930s would recede before the emotional one did. The wounds were quiet but deep. Anxieties about food, about banks, about the simple certainty of tomorrow. And they outlasted the empty cupboards. Even when the lights came back on, the shape of what had been lost remained, a shadow in the corners of daily life that shaped how a generation would live and teach the next. I only have the heading. Section 8. Government Collapse and Federal Response. I don't have the original fragment you want me to expand. To do exactly what you asked. Expand the passage fivefold without adding or changing facts, dates, or key events. I need the full text you want rewritten. Please paste the original fragment here. If you prefer, tell me a few quick details so I can match your needs. An approximate length or runtime for the voiceover, the tone you want, solemn, urgent, reflective, cinematic, and whether you'd like a single narrator or multiple perspectives. Those choices will help me shape pacing, emphasis, and the overall mood. If you don't have the fragment handy but want me to draft a historically accurate piece instead, tell me which episode to cover. I can write a richly narrated expansion on many moments of governmental collapse. For example, the 1917 Russian Provisional Government, Weimar Germany in 1923, or another specific episode you name, and keep the account faithful to the facts you specify. Paste the text, or give me the episode and the preferences above, and I'll produce a coherent, engaging voiceover that meets your length and tone requirements. With tax revenues evaporating, local and state governments struggled to pay teachers and police, or even to keep the lights on in city halls. Some municipalities went bankrupt entirely, their ledgers empty and their services gone. When the country teetered and old certainties cracked, it was only massive federal intervention, through Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs, that began to steady the fragile fabric of everyday life. From coast to heartland, the government put people to work on an unprecedented scale, sending wages to households that had been surviving on hope and handouts. They hired millions to cut roads through swamp and scrub, to raise dams that slowed wild rivers and promised light where there had been darkness, to lay the foundations of schools and set the beams for bridges that would span rivers and social divides alike. Those paychecks were more than money. They were a lifeline that flowed into kitchens, into rent payments, into the small things that kept a family afloat. Picture the crews at dawn, men in rolled sleeves and women organizing supplies, boots splashing in clay as teams laid gravel, stone, and concrete. Hear the steady clang of metal, the hiss of steamrollers smoothing a ribbon of new asphalt. Imagine a river tamed by a rising wall of poured concrete, a spillway channeling water into turbines that would brighten homes for the first time. Think of a one-room schoolhouse grown into a tidy brick building, paint drying on sills while children watched through dusty panes, their futures suddenly a little less uncertain. See a bridge taking shape across a gorge, timber and steel locking into place, linking isolated towns to markets and to one another. These were not just engineering feats. They were acts of civic care. Pay envelopes passed from foreman to worker were small miracles. A bought loaf of bread, a dentist's appointment, a letter mailed home. The work returned routine and purpose, the dignity of waking with a task, the quiet pride of watching a completed road carry its first car, a dam's reservoir glittering in the sun, a school's bell calling children back inside. People who had felt abandoned began to feel useful again. Across the nation, those projects stitched communities back together, replacing fear with a sense that the nation might still keep faith with its people. In that steady, practical work lay a deeper restoration, not only of an economy, but of hope itself. Section 9. Conclusion. Lasting national trauma. I don't see the historical fragment you want expanded. Please paste the exact text you'd like me to transform, and I will rewrite it as a vivid audiobook-ready narrative about 5 times longer, while keeping all facts, dates, and key events unchanged. When you send the fragment, I'll shape it into a coherent, fluid voiceover, smoothing repetitions, tightening transitions, and adding tasteful descriptive gestures to hold a listener's attention, while preserving every factual detail you provide. A few quick questions to make sure I match your expectations. Do you prefer a warm and reflective tone, dramatic and urgent, or neutral but lyrical? Should I write in first-person or third-person narration? Do you have a target runtime or word count? Are there any names, places, or terms that must remain exactly as written or pronounced in a specific way? Send the fragment and any answers you care about, and I'll produce the expanded, polished narration. The Great Depression was not just an economic downturn. It was a national trauma. A collapse that closed banks, emptied kitchens, stole homes, and shattered people's faith in the future. It reached into ordinary days and rearranged them, leaving a country that felt smaller, colder, and much less certain. When we think back, a few sharp images come first. The long, patient lines outside soup kitchens, the sudden stillness when the ticker stopped in trading rooms, the grainy photographs of parched fields turning to dust. Those images are true, and they hold power, but they are only the surface of something deeper. The Depression was not merely a string of bad days. It was a slow, grinding realignment of how people lived, how neighborhoods held together, and how institutions understood their duty to the public. Picture those bread lines, men with their hats in their hands, women pulling children close against the cold, faces both defiant and exhausted. Nobody stood there for pride. They stood because they had to. Imagine the trading floor in that moment of collapse. The sudden hush after months of frantic noise, brokers staring at a ticker that had once promised security and now delivered ruin. Out on the plains, the scene was different but no less brutal. Black skies that swallowed the sun, wind that took the topsoil, and with it, whole ways of life. Farms went empty, families left with what they could carry and walked on, the creak of a wagon wheel sounding like a small, private mourning. Those scenes bent the country into something new. Banks faltered and failed, workplaces closed their doors, and local governments were stretched to the breaking point. The expectations people held, that savings would be safe, that a job would last, that institutions would protect the vulnerable, were altered. Trust frayed in some places and deepened in others. In living rooms and on church steps, Folks learned to share what little they had, to bargain, and to protect one another. People learned to live with less and to measure risk with new, wary eyes. The wounds were not only financial, they touched habits and hearts, a generation carrying a quiet caution after watching savings evaporate. Families on the move, following rumors of work and a chance at a fresh start. Small acts of kindness becoming literal lifelines. The hot bowl of soup or an extra blanket passed across a fence. Those gestures kept people alive more than numbers on a ledger ever could. Out of that hardship came lessons we still need. Prosperity can be fragile, and social bonds matter in ways money cannot measure. Memory itself can become a safeguard. When we tell this story now, we do more than recall breadlines and grainy photographs. We listen for the echoes that shape how a nation cares for its people. Those echoes warn us, remind us, and insist that what we learned then must not be forgotten.